Coming up, why the Boston Celtics trade package feels the most realistic, the most tangible, and the most balanced for both the Boston Celtics, the Brooklyn Nets, Jaylen Brown, and Kevin Durant. Right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And, Doug, before we dive in on the conversation for YouTube, Doug's ready to go, locked in. Before we dive into the conversation around taking a look back at Boston and this Jaylen Brown centered trade, among others, a life question for you. Where is the doomsday clock on the fact that I broke a glass jar in my kitchen? I spent an hour vigorously wiping, cleaning, and vacuuming. But what's the countdown until I step on it? Like, should I just put glass in my foot right now?
Oh, you didn't get it all cleaned up?
I tried. I think. You know what I mean? But where's that mystery? Where's that mystery?
I would say it's certainty. I think the doomsday clock is like a minute to midnight right now. So your thing is probably just like around the same timeline. I would say that's like destined to happen. Although now that you're speaking into existence, I feel like you have a better chance. You made the right move here by bringing it up. Yeah. It's when you think about it quietly to yourself and then you do it later. So you're in when it comes to the universe and how the universe works, and this is just science. If you mention it, like if you mention it now, this isn't me. You can look it up. Look it up. If you mention it, you're going to be much better. So yeah, look it up. So there you go.
I'm also, as we dive in here, thank you. Good. And then I always go to Doug. For all sage-like advice, I go to Doug. I
do love the look it up crowd. That's like, that is one of my favorite.
Look it up.
Just look it up. Hey, why don't you look it up for me and send me the link? Like if you already know where they all are, like that, it'd be faster. Like you've already seemed like you got it. Anyway, we're going off the rails. Here we go. Let's go. So Nets talk.
As we dive in on the Nets talk, maybe this is, I don't know if this is kismet that I'm wearing what feels like a very aggressive Boston Celtics type of green shirt here. We wanted to tap back into these trade conversations, and actually before we, we're going to look at what it means to create a complementary roster to Kyrie Irving if we think we're going to move forward in that direction. So the question becomes what pieces fit, actually thinking about fit as opposed to just maximizing the value in the trade. But before we get into it, though, as we were at the start here, you kind of quietly started ruminating about the idea of what may be pending here for the Brooklyn Nets, for the Boston Celtics, and whether or not this Jaylen Brown-based trade is actually a little bit more fire than smoke.
Yeah, I'm actually becoming sort of convinced as I stew quietly to myself and, don't get feedback from the outside world. No, I am becoming. Yeah, look it up. I'm actually thinking that this ends up happening. For some reason, the fact that it was put out there that he was a real name put out in the trade, his timeline does actually line up with the Celtics, like really kind of considering trading him if they didn't feel like he was going to be sort of like a max guy going forward or something like that, or he was maybe just wanted to have his own team or something like that. And he had expressed
2 years from a contract.
Yeah, maybe doesn't want to be second fiddle to Jason Tatum for his whole career, which he's probably setting up to be if he re-signs after, because he's got only 2 years left. Like some of this is just kind of like, piecemealing information together. But as I thought about it, I started to think, different than all the other scenarios, like the Phoenix just doesn't have enough, right? Toronto, it's kind of only been rumored. They might not have enough if it's not with Barnes, and they don't seem like they want to get rid of Barnes. New Orleans has been mentioned only because they seem to have the assets, but I'm not sure what even their willingness to do it is. Like, do they want to pair Zion with KD? That's only been kind of rumored out there because they have the pieces, right? Boston, the fact that a real offer was made with like specific names, Brown starts getting you closer to the talent. I mean, it's the best piece that's really realistically been offered, point stop. I mean, that's easily the best player that's been mentioned so far. So not been mentioned from like all possible avenues, but like mentioned as saying, hey, we will give you Jaylen Brown for a package around Jaylen Brown for Kevin Durant. Right. I kind of think that this ends up happening. The only thing actually I wonder that would make it stop is that if Kevin Durant pushed back so hard and said he'll just do the same thing in Boston that he's doing in Brooklyn, which is like say I'll sit out. I kind of think short of that, I don't know. I bet you it happens. I think that all the other stuff, unlike all the other scenarios that you really had to squint to see it, this one you actually don't. And actually, then it just becomes a matter of what Boston is willing to put in that the Nets will say yes to. So I don't know. What do you think about that? It's mostly just because this is the first time I'm like, oh, like the Scotty Barnes one, I was like, oh, that'd be awesome. But but they're not. But Toronto's like, okay, great, we're not going to do it. But this one, the fact that they're willing to do it, I don't know. I'm wondering that by the time the season starts, if this is the deal that ends up getting done.
It's like when you talk about Phoenix, it was never discussed that Booker was on the table. But if it was, for Booker, sweet, like great.
Or before Ayton signed, like maybe you could sort of see it like a Ayton and Bridges thing or something. Like, but those are all off the table now. This one is on the table, and so I think it does lead into the next conversation, which again, like we're guessing at it, but in a world where Kevin Durant wants to be traded, where he probably wants to win a title, where he wants to be a part of a good organization, presumably. I mean, Boston kind of checks all those boxes. And the part where the Nets start to get back some youngish talent with upside, like this is as close as we've seen. And I'm wondering if as the summer goes on, this gets closer and closer.
Yeah, so the first thing I think you mentioned about, we know this was an older report that then finally came out, but hey, when things resurface, it makes you think maybe there's actually a little bit more to that there. To your point too, these other conversations aren't about teams that maybe are in a position coming up where they're going to make a big decision about a player like Jaylen Brown. These other teams, Scotty Barnes, if you're Toronto, you're saying that's the future. Right. So if we're going to sacrifice that, we're actually making a more difficult decision around our long-term prospects for some short-term success. So those things that I think do line up. The fascinating part about Kevin Durant, I do wonder, the reports were too that Jaylen Brown has a close relationship with Kyrie Irving as well. Amongst other players on that roster, there doesn't seem to be any animosity among the players with Kyrie Irving. And certainly that plays a role if they're coming in.
There never has been.
Yeah, never has been. It was, hey, I'm leaving Boston. And they all said, damn, we're going to miss having you here. That's what you're going to go do. Do you think that Kyrie Irving, because we'll get more into this conversation around the players specifically in a second from Boston, and how that can fit in Brooklyn. Do you think that Kyrie Irving's opinion of the Boston organization would factor into Kevin Durant's decision? If we think that these guys are still close off the basketball court, basketball-wise, it didn't work out, does that influence Kevin Durant in saying, whether or not I want to go somewhere and I find the pieces, Jaylen, obviously having Jason Tatum there, et cetera, that's attractive, but do I have reservations around Kyrie Irving's experience coming out of there?
I don't think so because, well, one, even if you did, this organization is just a little different now. I mean, they have a different coach than what, and he's a former Nets guy. I mean, that has to seem to help. Like Ime is really respected, right? So you would have to think that only helps the organization, even if there have been some bad blood there, which it really never seemed like with Kyrie. He didn't really seem to have bad blood with the organization.
He just changed his mind, and I don't mean that negatively. He just changed his mind from when he said he'd love to be back, and then said, "Oh, maybe I can go to Brooklyn and play with Kevin Durant."
Right. This looked like it represented a lot better of a situation. And really on paper, it did. So he wasn't really probably even wrong at the time. But, former Nets coach Ime Udoka, who probably could have been the head coach in some world, when they fire Atkinson, there's a world where that could have happened. Mm-hmm. This team was 2 wins away from the championship last year. So, they're right at the doorstep, even if they trade away some of these other guys. I think there's a lot you can talk yourself into if championships are just now Kevin Durant's only motivation now is to be on a well-run organization that wants to win championships, and other narratives like he needs to be the best guy or it's like his team or whatever, if all that is out the window, which a trade to Phoenix sure seemed like that was out the window for him. I think it does line up. And I don't even know if Kyrie's opinion, even if it was negative, would matter because it would have been supplanted by the fact that Boston just made it to the championship last year around this team with this coach. Even if that was the case, I can't imagine it matters.
And coming up in a second, I want to talk about the Ime Udoka connection and whether or not that has a positive or negative impact on Kevin Durant's decision. And then also, obviously, from a Brooklyn side, how do these pieces, what does this package specifically look like within reason that the Nets can try to assemble and still be successful in the short term?
All right, we're going to talk to you all about all that in a second. First, our friends over at betonline.net, the fastest and easiest way to check on all of your betting needs. If you go to betonline.net right now, you can check out the odds for Kevin Durant's next team, if not the Nets. So this is if you take the Nets off the table. Boston Celtics minus 175, Suns plus 350, and then you get actually the Warriors right there, and the Raptors at plus 400, and then it kind of trails off. Trailblazers? No thanks. Those are the odds that you have over there on betonline.net. You can find all the reviews and news for every single league. They're obviously got the MLB rolling. We're only a month or 2 away, or 2 months away from football really being on us every single Sunday. Golf, esports, it's all there for you at betonline.net. Go over there. You learn about all the trends, all of the action. Bet online, where the game starts.
Okay, so I want to dive in on the trade package specifically, but one more little caveat here around. There's so much that's happened with the Brooklyn Nets organization, but if Ime Udoka was someone that Kevin Durant liked and wanted to maybe see as his head coach, it maybe needs not be positive or negative, but he could have had Steve Nash fired and had Ime Udoka promoted to the head coach. The Brooklyn Nets organization did have obviously firsthand look at what Ime was capable of. Do you think that plays a factor? If we're just getting in Kevin Durant's mind here for a second and saying, like, is Boston an attractive spot for Kevin Durant? From a winning standpoint, you'd like to think so. Jason Tatum might be one of the best number twos you could possibly pair yourself with, along with the stability, as you mentioned, the organization has. I guess you wouldn't shy away from Ime Udoka, even if you didn't think or vocally support him sticking around the Nets team.
No way, man. I mean, turn that whole team around. That team, he gave that team, I can't believe I'm about to say it, identity. Like, he gave them a defensive identity, and they rolled it all the way to the championship. I mean, they smoked the Nets. Like, a lot of it was on scheme. Like, they had the talent, but they just out schemed them during that whole series. I mean, they didn't smoke. I know they swept them, but some of those games were closer. But anyway, really, regardless, they swept them. No, I think, and sometimes too with Ime, remember, like, we have a vision of what he is now. He was an assistant coach. Sometimes it's hard to see. And by the way, if you took the temperature of this halfway through the Celtics season, this would have been a very different talking point. There was questions around what he was doing. The team was not looking very good. They were really struggling. So this stuff can really change very quickly. That being said, he got 2 games away from the promised land in his first season as the Celtics head coach because he stuck to what he believed was going to work. Kevin Durant, we know, respects basketball. Like, and we know this for a fact. Like, he respects, like, good basketball minds, guys who, like, live and die with the game. Like, that is the kind of guy he is. That's his whole entire life, basically. And I without knowing exactly what his feelings are, my strong guess around this would be, like, Ime's right the kind of guy. Now, if Ime was not the front runner to become the Nets head coach at the time, because these guys didn't really endorse that. Like, the Steve Nash thing came up as a thing, and I'm sure everyone embraced it. We did too. So it's like, I'm not retroactively giving revisionist history around that, but I just don't, I can't imagine. It wouldn't be a turn off. I don't think, whether it's a turn on, I'm not sure, but I can't imagine it like sways you against it.
No, and ultimately, I think you mentioned it's the sample size you get. You don't know what he's capable of. Then you get to see from afar what Boston does, and that can change your opinion if you're Kevin Durant about what's attractive. And ultimately, if you're someone like Kevin Durant who believes in being coached and is receptive to being coached, Ime Udoka in that way becomes that much more intriguing of an opportunity. Specifically inside this package, then, let's first, would you say, because we're trying to just frame this in a reasonable way. We're not saying, okay, then we get to take whatever we want. We're not worried about the picks right now. We can take whatever you want off your roster. Thanks so much. If Marcus Smart is off the table, if that cannot be a part of what comes back in this package, and we're still going to have Kyrie Irving here, Jaylen Brown and what is satisfying for you? And I mean, we can say, up to 3 players. You mentioned yesterday's episode how the money for Jaylen Brown is as big a factor as anything because it helps already line up that $44 million for Kevin Durant. Do you go in saying, give me Jaylen Brown and Robert Williams, right? That's the first thing you say because, okay, no more Marcus Smart. We'll take those 2 guys and then we'll work from there, picks, etc. That's fine. If Boston refutes that, do you then do you then turn around and go, okay, Grant Williams and Derek White, that's good enough? And do you feel like confident about that package coming back?
Yeah, with like a few picks, I would
Yeah,
get.
yeah.
It's pretty close. Look, again, this is easily the best like realistic offer on the table, and you made mention of them. So I'll go through each part. One is the money. The problem with trading for a guy like Barnes, let's say, right? The problem with trading for him was that you're always going to have to attach pretty significant money to them to that player because his salary, because of the rules, the salary doesn't even come close to matching Durant's. So then you're like, that's why you start throwing in like Siakam or or
OG
Gary
and Trent
Trent,
Jr. because they get you
OG,
up
right?
over
Exactly.
34 million. Yeah.
Right. With the Suns, it's why the package is like Mikal Bridges and like every single crappy contract on their entire books, right? Because you're trying to get all the way there. It doesn't help the Nets at all to have all this money. It's just trying to get all the money lined up, which would have been a little easier with Ayton, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
With New Orleans is a little easier because Ingram's like kind of pretty much a max guy, so it does line up there. But with Jaylen, yeah, like the money's not exactly 1-to-1 with the Nets. With KD. KD makes 44 and Jaylen Brown makes 28.7. But then you throw in a guy like Derek White, who's kind of like they don't need him as much anymore with Malcolm Brogdon coming onto the roster. And so like that, and that's a guy that could be helpful to the Nets. It's like not a guy you build around or anything. He's 28, whatever. It'd be a little bit of salary fodder. If you replace him with Marcus Smart, yeah, then money starts to really work. If you had a team of Ben Simmons, assuming he's back to 2 years ago, Ben Simmons, Jaylen Brown, Kyrie Irving, Marcus Smart, and like literally anybody else, Claxton, center, like some of the shooters they have, that's a pretty darn good team. It's not a championship caliber team by any means, but that's easily a playoff team and a playoff team that you probably don't want to face in the first round because they can play just enough defense if Simmons is back to his regular self. They could definitely score. And again, they're probably like that one big super wing away from being a championship team. But yeah, man, that'd be like a really competitive team that we would have a lot of fun watching, assuming it all kind of clicked into place. And then if Kyrie left, he left, and it's still probably pretty competitive going forward if you can re-sign Jaylen. So this is where I do think like some of the needs of both teams start to dovetail together.
And see, and this is, I know what Marcus Smart is. We all know what he is. But if you think that the Boston Celtics want to maintain him and he'd be this key component of what they're going to accomplish with KD and with Tatum there on that roster. But it's funny that I actually look at it and go, like, I know Robert Williams is the very attractive young player. Grant Williams is also young too. And in a lot of ways, I know he's in the last year of his contract. But I probably look at it and go, like, if I can get Jaylen Brown and Grant Williams for what he does as a wing, I start to think about that. And then you probably do get Derek White just for the money purposes. Like it comes up a little bit short financially if it's just Jaylen Brown and Grant Williams and then picks. You still need to clear another little less than $3 million to make it work. But if you do that, I think what's funny about we talk about creating this complementary roster, then all of a sudden the Joe Harris move, right? The Seth Curry move to maybe bring in another piece becomes that much more attractive. If you're sitting there with Jaylen Brown and Derek White, and then it's your choice, but you're pushing between these two, are you happy to get Grant Williams in that scenario and not necessarily as concerned, knowing what Robert Williams has showcased? It does feel like rebounds and that type of that mold of player. I can go find maybe another one of those as opposed to wanting to get a little bit of length, a little bit of muscle, and a little bit of perimeter work.
Yeah, Grant Williams is on an expiring contract here. Like it was a team option. It was smart of the Celtics to pick it up, $4.3 million. He'll be in line for some more money after what he did last season. He's pretty two-dimensional. Like he shoots threes from the corner, elite, and he plays good defense. So really good defense. He seems a little nuts, but like whatever. I think that adding him is fine. All these pieces are fine. Like Jaylen Brown is the key. Like Jaylen Brown is the centerpiece. It's not good enough. Like he's not good enough to go 1-for-1 with Durant. So obviously this is where you do it. I do think that all this is a little bit on a sliding scale. I think some version of this is going to be just fine. I actually probably think where it breaks down is if the Nets say, hey, you just have to send like one of Robert Williams or Marcus Smart back. Right. Because that's like the next tier of guys. And then the Celtics just say, we can't send either of those guys back. If it was going to break down, it would not break down around the picks. It would break down probably around one of those two guys. Because I think the Nets would have to demand that one of those two guys come back along with Brown. And then the Celtics might think that that's just too much. Right. And so,
and this is the only tricky part about this is that the Celtics don't have a lot of assets beyond the players to send back Brooklyn's way, right? The max is kind of around this 3 picks and a couple of swaps. And I'm not saying that that's not enough to get the deal done, but knowing what Boston is going to be at the top of the conference and highly competitive, right? So you lose a little bit of value in the asset piece, which is where, just to your point, if you're having this debate with Boston around what are you willing to give up, I love pushing for Marcus Smart because I'll use the word one more time. If you want to have a guy that brings some identity, boy, would Marcus Smart bring that identity to this team. And even in Robert Williams, you get value there. I think at the end of the day, if it ends up moving from saying, and this is just throwing it out there, 3 picks and 2 swaps, but we want Marcus Smart or we want Robert Williams, 2 picks and 2 swaps, right? Take 1 pick off the table and get that player that you desire. I think it's okay for the Nets to look at it in that equation, especially when dealing with Boston, unlike some of these other teams where they have assets coming from other rosters around the NBA and you can dream on them being higher first-round picks.
All right, I'll tell you in a second why that the piece around Jaylen Brown the piece around the draft picks is matters a little bit less in this situation as well. All right, so just to respond to the piece around the Boston assets, here's another part where I get less concerned with this part as well, because Jaylen Brown is worth a lot of draft picks. Like, what would Jaylen Brown, if you put Jaylen Brown on the open market right now for to go to OKC, right? Let's say, who has a ton of, his age and stuff lines up a little bit with their timeline and whatever. What would OKC have to give Boston for Jaylen Brown? 4 picks, like 4 first rounders? Like, he's really good.
Put him on the Donovan Mitchell scale, right? They're talking about 5 or 6 first round picks. He may not be fully there, but he's
not there, but he's
4 first round picks might be the floor.
Like, when we start to compare it to the Gobert trade or the DeJounte Murray trade, you have to, he's worth a lot of picks. So you can't say hey, him plus 7 picks. That's not right. You're already getting a bunch of that. You're already getting the true asset back, which is a guy you already know is good. The picks are nice. Picks take a lot to, it might take you 4 picks to get a Jaylen Brown before it's all said and done, because the way the NBA works and where you draft and all this other stuff. So I'm less worried about what Boston can send back in terms of picks. And I still think they would, because they offered it, but you don't need to get the kind of crazy haul. Jaylen Brown right now is better than any of the guys that went for even these other packages. Like the Ingram package when he came over for AD. He was good, but he wasn't Brandon Ingram now. And all those other guys, they weren't, Jaylen Brown's pretty much already there now. And so I just don't get as worried about what Boston doesn't have in that respect, because I just don't think they need to send as much, because they're sending the best player already. So
you actually bring up an interesting point there too. And I agree with you about, we fast forward a season and a half from now, and Jaylen Brown is in the final year of his contract, and you're heading towards the deadline, and all of a sudden the Brooklyn Nets make another move. But I'll come a step forward from that. And because you made me think about it, the Brooklyn Nets, we're talking about how does this roster construct with Jaylen Brown and with Marcus Smart and, with Grant Williams, but getting a third team involved in this deal and having Jaylen Brown just end up on OKC and adding in more draft capital to the trade package that comes to Brooklyn ultimately, right? Kevin Durant to Boston, Jaylen Brown to OKC. The Nets get a couple of young assets from here and from there, and then maybe gets draft capital as well. Just on that idea of, do you care more about, and we've talked about being competitive and, wanting to still be a competitive team and put a product on the court. Do you care more about stockpiling the opportunities to go with your own guys to develop your own core, or sacrificing, quote unquote, I'm putting in quotes, sacrificing draft capital for that proven commodity? So would you take Jaylen Brown right now and say, hey, listen, if we can get him in here and he looks good and he complements with Kyrie, a year from now, we can be re-signing Kyrie Irving, extending Jaylen Brown a year early and moving forward as that is the core? Or do we just want to have our options open? We want to be as flexible as possible over the next 1 or 2 years.
Oh, I'd always take the player every time. The player that you kind of know what they are, and you can hope that they haven't realized their full potential yet because they're not in their prime. Again, it would take so many of these assets to recreate getting a Jaylen Brown. I'm not saying Jaylen Brown's the be all end all or the best player in the world, but just look at the list of the best players in the NBA. Drafting is hard. The spots where they're going to be drafting with a lot of these picks are not going to be good. All the teams that they're going to trade with, they're sending Kevin Durant to those teams. So those teams' draft picks are just arguably going to be worse. Even when you start wrapping in other squads, OKC, I don't think they would. Frankly, I'll just go back to what you said. I don't think they would do that because they're gonna have their own money issues here in a little while. They've got so many young guys. They're gonna be coming up on the same sort of pay scale timeline.
Send them to us.
Yeah, either they're gonna have to package a guy. They're gonna have to send some guys out at some point. Anyway, I would always take the dude because you know what that guy is pretty much. And you can like already see it with the draft picks. It's such a long haul. And again, when you're rebuilding, you should do it. You take as many bites as the apple as possible, because that's how you're going to land with, developing a real star. The Nets aren't on that timeline. They can't be on that timeline. They can't, rely only on draft picks to get this done. The best thing they can do now is to bring a youngish player through the door, take the next 2 seasons to convince them why Brooklyn's the long-term answer, re-sign them, and then get a little better through the draft here and there, or make some other, ancillary moves, sign another free agent if Kyrie walks, like stuff like this. They still have Ben Simmons. It's so funny. I will say, it's so funny when we talk about this. We never seem to include, I'm guilty of this, maybe more than ever. We never include all the guys. It's just like, how did Jaylen Brown and Kyrie fit? And it's like, how did Jaylen Brown and Simmons fit? Like, we never include all the guys together, kind of. Because remember, it's like, hey, how did Jaylen Brown, Kyrie, and Simmons fit? Like, it's I don't know. I think we do. I think it's just the way the Nets have been set up over the last couple of years has been so all over the place that you just can't picture them all together. But
well, oddly enough, like we talked about, we appreciate everyone in the comments, right? We took a little bit of, I'll say flack, but it was just, hey, like what rabbit hole are you guys going down around this Ben Simmons thing? And again, it was only to get to the place of like, there are so many curiosities and wrinkles, and it almost feeds into, it's like, what does it look like with just Kyrie Irving? What does it look like with just Ben Simmons? Because this idea that we could think that we're going to have both Kyrie and Ben, or both any versions of this, we're so far away from that being a comfortable thought process that you have to isolate it. And to your point, Jaylen Brown with Ben Simmons and with Kyrie Irving and with Marcus Smart, like all of a sudden we talked about, that's a competitive playoff team. Maybe it's a little bit of a dangerous playoff team that you don't want to have to see. I just want to, since we ended up staying now, as we know, Doug has confirmed the Boston Celtics will make this trade for Kevin Durant. You can get after him in the comments for 100% commitment to it. The other thing being, though, you mentioned Ingram and where he is now in his career versus where he was at the time of the AD trade. Just for the sake of fodder, if that trade package is Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, and Grant Williams, those are the 3 players, and the picks are what they are. Is there an Ingram and 2 guys off of their roster that you would look at and say, I find that more attractive from a player perspective, adding in with Kyrie Irving, adding in with Ben Simmons, and saying, this is a better outlook for this team? Let's just take off the table for the moment whether or not the Pelicans will be fully committed to that idea for Kevin Durant. Would that make sense for you? Because I can look over there and see Brendan Ingram and obviously Jackson Hayes as maybe the first 2 pieces. Is it going to be Graham? Name player X, but the money works there. It all lines up and would obviously make the Pelicans a contender, as every team would be with McCollum and the other pieces they have. Zion being a big piece of that. You muted.
yeah, they don't have the second guy like a Smart, I'll just put Smart up there.
Yeah.
They don't have that guy. That guy's, by the way, that guy's not Devontae Graham. I've seen people wanting after Devontae Graham. Please, go look at that's just not the guy they want. And people are like, oh, he'd be a point guard. He's not a point guard. He's a shooting guard. He was all spot up threes last season. He didn't do anything else.
And
he was
6'1", by the way.
He was like one of the highest ratios of 3-point scoring to actual scoring in the whole league. So I think people have a wrong sense of who Devontae Graham is. Anyway, so that's a no on Devontae Graham.
Into it, though.
It's that's interesting actually. Yeah, maybe, but actually you threw me off of that one because I was more going to take a dig at the Jackson Hayes. I was going to take a dig at the Jackson Hayes thing, and then but then
let's go. This is perfect though. Let's go matchup to matchup. Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, and Grant Williams, or Brendan Ingram, Jackson Hayes, and Trey Murphy.
Oof. Put me on the spot here. I take the Ingram one. I think
I like what the length of Ingram, what he is as a player, combined with the position he plays, right? The size that he brings, and then you're arguably bring in again more length, more size, right? A little more versatility, I would say, in the Pelicans package. However realistic or not that might be, but the real curiosity I brought up is just to say I think that's the threshold that you now set by having this Boston offer potentially on the table. The question becomes, is Boston willing to put a Marcus Smart in there? Because that's what then motivates another team, right? If it's Jaylen Brown, Grant Williams, and Derek White, well, that Ingram, then the Pelicans package is a hands down. You feel like you go that direction automatically because Derek White isn't a part of the future.
Yeah, And I'll always just default to the Boston one now because it's just more real. Like we just know that it was offered. Like Tatum felt like he needed to respond to it. He did come out and say, "Hey, I like the team we have." I don't know what else he was going to say. That's the correct answer.
Right.
But now that I do wonder what happens now that Jaylen Brown knows that his name's been floated out there. Like I think that could cause some discord. I wonder if he starts to push the issue a little bit too, knowing that like his name has been kind of always been floating out there. That baggage from New Orleans is good. That's something the Nets would clearly say yes to, I think, or some version of that would be getting pretty close. New Orleans has a lot of assets also in terms of picks. But yeah, no, I think I would just always default to the Boston. But I'm only just trying to be realistic because I just know that one feels the most palatable right now because there's actual like hardcore reporting that there was discussion around it, where the New Orleans thing really has mostly been, and a lot like Toronto in some way, has mostly been floated out there because they had the guys to make it work. Not as much that there was mutual interest, but they actually had the salaries and the skill guys that did line up. And so few teams have that it just never made sense to even explore it, right? You can knock off 3/4 of the teams because they can't even begin to start the package really around Durant or want to. So that's why I'm just still defaulting to Boston because I'm just trying to keep myself sane, buddy. These are weird, wacky times for me.
By the way, and I think you're right. Again, once Kevin Durant's available, well, everyone's interested. Okay, but where is it realistic? And what teams are actually capable of giving up the assets? And where does it keep Kevin Durant on a competitive NBA championship level team, right? So we do start to refine that down. And as of right now, this moment, the Boston is the most realistic one. The irony is, while it may drive you insane, it seems to only feed me. The speculation, the rumors, the possibilities.
No, actually,
I love it.
It's only insane trying to keep up with all the different like angles of it. It's not insane to think about this as actual realistic thing. I think that, like I said, we started off by saying that I think this feels the most realistic of anything during the offseason. This feels as realistic as a starting point as we've actually seen reported rather than just teams that are interested. Okay, we're gonna get out of here for the weekend. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Leave us some comments. Much appreciated. Live chats for the premieres. Leave some comments. Try to get back to a bunch of people that had some nice thing to say. Some not so much over at the Ben Simmons thing. No worries. Try to give everyone the love. Much appreciated. It means you watch. It means you listen. That's really what we're going for. So make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Don't lie. Life is a puzzle, and we're all unique pieces. When you lie, you make it impossible to find your true place in the grand design. Dr. Steve Maraboli.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We will be back again next week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.